In July 1863, the community of New York City was made up of working-class whites, Irish Americans, and African Americans, all in constant competition for jobs and housing. Poor working conditions for Irish immigrants and poor working-class whites resulted in several strikes in June, in which black workers were brought in to replace the strikers. In addition to blaming African Americans for their job displacement, Irish Americans and poor whites also blamed African Americans for causing the Civil War, and racial tensions in New York were extremely high. 1 month after the June strikes, on Saturday, July 11, 1863, Provost Marshal officers began the draft process under the new Enrollment Act of Conscription in what was already a hostile and angry community. The results of the draft were then published in the Sunday morning newspaper on July 12th. Similar to the Detroit Draft Riot in May 1863, the lower-class community of New York was angered by the exemption clause, which allowed wealthy citizens to pay a $300 exemption fee, making them exempt from the draft and discriminating against lower-class citizens who could not afford the fee. Many citizens who were not in support of the Civil War were now not only being forced to enlist, but also being forced to take the place of wealthier men who purchased their exemption. When the draft list was published Sunday morning, those men whose names were listed congregated together in bars and on the streets to protest the draft and threaten to riot if the draft was continued the next day. On July 13, 1863, rioters gathered outside the Provost Marshal office, attacking the officers, setting fire to the building, and eventually burning down the entire block. In another part of the city, rioters attacked the Asylum for Colored Orphans, and what began as a riot against the unfair practices of the draft quickly became a race war. All of the children and staff were able to escape the building before rioters destroyed and looted the orphanage, then set fire to the building. African Americans throughout the city were beaten, tortured, and even killed. One black man was attacked by a crowd of more than 400 people and eventually lynched and set on fire. In an account of the riot published by the New York police, they described the attack on several black citizens, including the following. Joseph Jackson, colored, aged 19 years, was in the industrious pursuit of his humble occupation of gathering provender for a herd of cattle, and when near the foot of 34th Street, East River, July 15, was set upon by the mob, killed, and his body thrown into the river. Rioters targeted African American homes, businesses, employers, draft offices, and wealthy whites, destroying over 50 buildings and homes with estimated damages in the millions. One servant in the St. John's Episcopal Church reported that, while passing through Clarkson Street, she had seen a colored man hanging on a tree, and men and women setting him on fire as he dangled from the branches. Chants were heard throughout the city of "Down with the Rich" and "There Goes the $300 Man" in reference to the exemption clause. In total, 105 people died, and at least 11 black men were lynched. The New York Draft Riot continued for 3 days as a result of the majority of the New York State militia having been called away a few days earlier to assist in the Battle of Gettysburg. The New York City police did their best to disband the riot, but were often overrun by rioters. John A. Kennedy, the police superintendent, was beaten to an almost unconscious state. When the New York State militia returned back to the city along with thousands of federal troops, the riots ended on July 16, 1863. To maintain order, 20,000 federal troops remained in the city and monitored subsequent drafts in August 1863. In the aftermath of the riot, the New York Tribune reported on August 3rd that, quote, "a large number of colored families have left the city." The New York City Draft Riot, similar to the Detroit Draft Riot, was an example of the racial tensions and prejudices that existed in so-called free states in those states that had abolished slavery years before. For African Americans, the struggle for freedom was more complex than simply abolishing slavery. The ideas of racial prejudice, discrimination, and superiority also needed to be eradicated in the minds and hearts of fellow Americans. As the American Civil War continued, so did African Americans fight for equal rights and fair treatment.